I want to first recognize and thank the many volunteers whose labor make these sessions happen behind the scenes, including the CASC board and our fearless leader, Judith Harris, who has somehow walked us through this virtual maze with calm and good humor. So a special thanks to Judith and Isabel, of course. Isabel Findley has provided a firm hand on the tiller, keeping us focused and on track. And Daria, I want to really give a shout out to. He did a lot of heavy lifting to get us here today. I also want to thank the workers who've labored to make the mammoth undertaking of Congress possible. This includes both the Federation staff like Sam and also the many U of A staffers who have helped to bring this off. Their work has obviously made our work in these sessions possible. Finally, of course, since this session is being hosted by the University of Alberta, and that is, of course, located on treaty land and is part of the Métis homeland, I want to acknowledge our Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit hosts, friends, and colleagues from the Edmonton region. Final comment before we turn it over to our first presenter. We will have 3 panelists, 15 minutes each. We hope to have 15 minutes for questions afterwards. I'll keep an eye on the chat box. So if you have questions, please type them in there. I'll try and keep a speakers list so that we can give as many people turn at bat as possible. So let me turn it over to, I guess, Anthony then is going to start.
Hello, I'm Adam Paler and I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham and a research associate at Conestoga College. Today I'm going to be presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Anthony Piscitelli, who's a professor at Conestoga College, and Dr. Sean Goby, who is an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo. Today I will be presenting our research titled Understanding the Paradox of School Board Trustees, Representing Constituents While Governing Effectively. This research is funded through a Shirk Insight Development Grant and is part of a broader research project, which I'll briefly touch on the other components of this research project later in this presentation. This research builds on the research by my 2 colleagues and the research agenda they set out in their 2020 articles cited here. In this research, they identified that prevailing governance theory suggests effective governance of an organization requires the board to focus primarily on strategy while leaving operational matters to management. This same governance theory literature also suggests that representation of the organization's membership by the board is an important function of the board, underpinned by the conceptualization of the relationship between the membership and the board as one of a principal and an agent. However, this representative function is often left up to management given the typically operational nature of members' concerns. So there exists, therefore, a seemingly incongruence or a tension between the idea of effective governance, so sticking to strategy and out of operations, and this representative function. Despite this tension, my colleagues contended in their article that this is a false dichotomy and that representation is an important function and that reconciling this function with effective governance, so again, the board sticking to strategy rather than operations, may lead to improved accountability of the board. Finally, my colleagues also identified the need for further research to explore this incongruence or tension, in particular, to determine how this idea of strategy versus operations and the representation function is navigated in practice within a nonprofit context, where the interests of members are perhaps not as clear as in the for-profit context, and by investigating how boards conceive of their role as individual directors representing their membership and what members expect of their board of directors. School boards were identified as an interesting case given their large membership base, with arguably diverse interests of their membership base and elections, so that direct representative link between the membership and the board. So our research looks at school boards in particular by looking at how do school board trustees conceive their role in representing their constituents. While perhaps not as relevant to this conference, this research also seeks to make a contribution to the special purpose body literature, which is understudied despite its importance, and where questions of board accountability to those they serve, similarly conceptualized through the lens of principal-agent theory, are at the fore. Finally, from a practitioner perspective, this research also maintains relevance given the shrinking power of school board trustees in Ontario in recent decades, as well as the recent proposals in other provinces, most notably Quebec and Manitoba, that look to abolish school board trustees. So in order to examine how school board trustees conceive their role in representing their constituents, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 25 school board trustees in Ontario. So a significant number of these trustees served as chair or vice chair, or are currently in the post as chair or vice chair, and they tended to be long-serving and interested in questions of governance and perhaps more aware of some of the nuance of their role. 15 school boards were represented, so 3 English Catholic boards and 12 English public boards, and interviews were conducted between December of last year and January of this year via Zoom. So we took a grounded theory approach to the analysis of this data, of our interview data, and we used NVivo to do so. So although not the focus of today's presentation, we also completed semi-structured interviews with an additional group of board of directors from other nonprofit organizations across Canada as a comparator group. As part of the same SSHRC funding that I mentioned earlier and same SSHRC project, we also have looked at what do constituents expect of their trustees, and we've done this through an online survey of 2,500 residents in Ontario with a higher proportion of parents that have students. So this is to complement us looking at how trustees conceive their role, but also looking to find out what constituents actually expect of their trustees in Ontario. These are the 3 main findings of our semi-structured interviews with school board trustees in Ontario that I'd like to bring to your attention today and briefly explore. Our first finding is that there is an inherent paradox in the role of school board trustees in Ontario. The role of school board trustees is strategy focused. However, school board trustees are elected to represent specific constituents, and the concerns of their most vocal constituents, so parents with school-aged children, are primarily operational in nature. So examples of operational concerns include issues in the classroom or in the school, busing, school catchment areas, school closures, among other operational concerns. From this paradox also flows further tension between local and single issue perspectives versus the system and general perspectives in which their strategy focused role requires. Our second finding is that the line between strategy and operations is fluid and largely context dependent. Despite the consistent legislative framework across the province, variation exists in terms of how strategy and operations are interpreted at each school board. The Director of Education plays a central role in establishing where this line between strategy and operations might reside. And finally, the relationship between individual school board trustees and the Director of Education, superintendents, and principals are critical to the ability of school board trustees to operate within the gray area between strategy and operations in representing their constituents. Our third finding is that in order to represent their constituents, school board trustees adopt a number of informal roles in navigating the gray area between strategy and operations. I'm going to briefly now touch on each of these informal roles that we've identified so far from the data. These are the 6 informal roles we've identified that school board trustees adopt, and we will now in turn review each of them. What we categorize as the navigator role is one of the roles most frequently adopted by school board trustees. And this is really about school board trustees guiding parents through the system in order to address their operational concerns. And this could be whether it's guiding them through the escalation from the teacher to the principal to the superintendent to the director of the education, or directing them to other specific resources or personnel that may exist to help them address their operational concern. Trustees also adopt what we categorize as the influencer role. And the influencer role is when trustees use the informal power they may wield in order to influence staff to, first, take the operational concerns of parents seriously, and second, to find exceptions to the policy or creative solutions to the operational concerns raised by the parents. The adoption of the influencer role or a trustee's success in the role appears to be largely based on the relationships trustees maintained with staff. School board trustees also adopt an important role in what we categorize as a listener role. So this is a more passive role where trustees provide parents with an outlet for airing their operational concerns, and for lack of a better term, for venting. Even if nothing can be done by the trustee to address the parents' concerns, parents appear to be appreciative of the opportunity to be heard by someone of perceived importance at the top of the organizational hierarchy. School board trustees also play the role of what we've identified as the translator. As a third party that understands the world of parents and the worlds of staff, trustees are able to interpret between the two groups in order to facilitate solutions to operational concerns. Sometimes school board trustees are required to adopt what we refer to as the educator role. Trustees may be required to educate parents on the role of the trustee and what they can and cannot do, the difference between strategy and operations, the importance of adhering to policy set by the board, school board jurisdiction versus provincial jurisdiction, among other items, and ultimately provide justification as to why parents may not receive the outcome they desire to address an operational concern. Finally, the last role we've identified is the uploader role. The uploader role essentially refers to school board trustees gathering similar operational concerns and reframing them at the board table in order to address them from a policy standpoint. This concludes this portion of our presentation. My colleagues and I look forward to meeting with you at Answer and discussing our research further. Thanks very much for listening.
So I'll go now. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Have you ever wanted to, felt there's more potential to engage people in your organization in a way that lights them on fire? I'm going to present some work that we did over the last year, developing a member-led cooperative governance model using a social innovation process design. So I did this also in Anthony's group. My name's Tristan Wright. I'm a PhD student at the University of Waterloo. We worked with Sean Campbell, who's the executive director of the co-op we worked with. Many of you may know, but Anthony is a professor at Conestoga College who runs a research group looking at all kinds of things in the social economy. My background originally is in engineering. So I did underwater robotics, embedded systems, and I thought, I was going to take all carbon out of mining. And then they were doing robotics, and the US military bought us this school, gave us security clearances, and that led me to sort of go back and really dive into what does transform systems, like what are the pieces that can make a difference. And that led me to the study of social innovation, of how systems are transformed. And increasingly, it's come down to the purpose economy, structure of ownership. So what this conference focuses on, and social innovation processes, like endemically listening organizations that are able to really build capacity in ways that unlock people. The group that we worked with is Union Cooperative, a cooperative that buys and refurbishes existing property for social purpose affordable housing, perpetual affordable housing. And the process we use is this social innovation. We drew on a social innovation lab process, which is a process design that we did a book on a few years ago. And it really came out of this core tension in the process design literature between processes that unlock energy, like future search, community capacity building, and processes that bring in expertise and expert knowledge. So we looked at that tension. We brought in, worked with 5 of the leading process designers and came up with a long process design. And then this is part of, well, how do we take the key pieces, what worked in those long, expensive, $500,000 plus lab methods where we're away with key people for multiple weekends over the course of years. And what can we do with a couple of Zoom meetings? So really pushing the limit of the technology. For us, we did 3 meetings in this. So in this talk, I'm going to share like what we did in our meetings and the kind of clarity that we got from these meetings, and then give you enough of a sense of a seed method, a structure of a meeting that you would hopefully feel comfortable taking it and running with it. So booking one of these meetings tomorrow, which I'd encourage you if you have an organization that you'd like to engage, it is a great process. So we did 3 processes. The first focused on values, the why. The second on who and what. So who are the stakeholders and what decisions does the membership and other stakeholders, where do people want to be engaged? And then how do we want to make decisions? What kind of voting methods versus past the post, various kinds of ranked ballot systems, and what kind of supporting structures around that. In the first meeting, engage people in a bunch of sort of mapping and listing and discussion, and then prioritizing of values, and really came to an understanding that there's this strong balance between the core cooperative values of democratic control, meaningful experience, stewardship, and sustainability, and those things that would maximize the impact of that purpose, the efficiency, the growth, the measurement, because the focus of that particular group is on how do you scale this? How do you make a new normal? How do you make a new base? Then did some mapping of, in the second meeting, mapping of stakeholders, and came to some clarity around where is the energy for membership involvement. So I'm building the cooperative, strategic planning and operational decisions, and then supporting property purchases and supporting property ownership. Out of 27 odd possible decisions, we mapped out every detail of what would be involved and then engage people in taking along that process. Then in the final meeting, we looked at voting, voting methods and decision-making processes. Wanted to look for really democratic ranked ballots, came out well, so sort of democratic ways of making those micro level decisions. But that discussion led to a discussion of the decisions are only as good as the options that are put on the table. So how do we structure committees that are open and engaged that can feed in to surfacing the alternatives and actually generating options? And then those who have the energy and capacity in the room, that's only a small share of the number of people who we want to reach. So how do we engage more broadly, like community cafes, open future processes, asking people to join committees, sharing the membership. So we made a kind of map of these other ways that we can reach out and engage. So how did we do it? We found the process quite evocative, but it came down to, so there's sort of endless ways that you can run this kind of process, but you can get 80% of the benefit. We, 80% of the benefit was basically one kind of meeting design. We tested it. I'd convened 10 or so meetings kind of like this prior to this session. We had our 3 meetings, brought it together into the board meeting, and since then have done 4 roughly similar meetings where we've tested this design. So I'll just share quickly the design with the goal that you have enough clarity that you can try it, and I can share materials after if it's helpful. So really comes down to what do you need to do before? It's focused on Zoom rather than in person, because that's what we had a chance to do in this session. Absolute clarity, really having one idea. As soon as you have a slightly confused idea or trying to do 2 or 3 things, or you can't say why you're there, it starts to fall apart. People get tired during the meeting. Simplicity. We tried meetings over the larger set of between sort of an hour to 3 hours. And you do start to lose people, especially in an evening meeting after about 50 minutes. So you have one idea, 50 minutes, keeping it as simple as possible, and mapping how things connect, and then surveys. So I'll take you through how each of those go, and then how you follow up matters. So clarity, we focused on developing a governance model. So we had in conversation, sort of Sean Anthony and Sean Goby and I developed these questions, and that guided the process. But it could be anything, right? Do you want to engage a particular community? Do you want to learn something from history? So have one clear question that you want to answer with the meeting. Second, one idea, 50 minutes. You do lose people. We booked an hour and a half, and when we succeeded in getting the essential piece into 50 minutes, you could just feel more energy in the room. So it's fine to have a bit of time, have time for networking afterwards, allow people to stay for a bit more conversation, but really anchoring in around keeping it concise if you're bringing people to a Zoom meeting, at least in this context. Early on in the process, so in terms of how to start, early on in particular, it can help to have some kind of a case, whether that is an example, a living case, an example of someone doing something, and maybe there's a 5-minute video that you can share. We had another organization present what they'd done in our first meeting, and it made it longer and introduced challenges, but the common language that was developed listening to that talk, you could hear brought back in every single meeting that came after it. So a 5-minute video introducing a concept or a case can be inspiring, can be a really good way of building common language. The heart of the meeting, we ended up really cycling around using this in teaching. There's this methodology of think, pair, share. So if you have a problem, have people have some time to think individually, then work in pairs or small groups, and then share the answers back, right? So that balances different ways of engaging and the benefit of sort of individual reflection with working together. So in a Zoom meeting, what this looked like is when there was a new concept introduced or when coming back, giving people 2 to 5 minutes, so usually about 3 minutes, to reflect on their own thinking, develop an answer to a question. So what is the value that stands out to you most, for instance? And we found it worked well to say write in the chat, but don't press enter. And then after the 2-3 minutes, have them press enter. Then breaking into small groups. So it can be as small as pairs. We typically went with 4 to 6 people. Even numbers work really well in Zoom because it makes a nice grid. And then a sharing back. So this is the sort of summary of what happens at a meeting. Sometimes you do a couple of things, but really a sort of think, pair, share structure. And in sharing back, we used Lucid in a number of the follow-up meetings. So we didn't do this during ours, but in 3 community meetings since, we mapped with Lucid, and it worked really, really well for people to just see. They could jump in and take notes, but specifically notes that let you move Post-its around. So you can start to cluster and people can start to co-create. We allowed people also to enter in the chat, and also had a shared Google document that people could take notes in during the group. So we did some processing of this into the mapping. This gave us, quotes that we can use to reinforce each of the points when we're doing the mapping, but it also just gives a way to collect as much rich material from the meeting as possible. And some people will speak in the discussion, and some people will be more comfortable to write or to map or to speak. So the more we can just reinforce across different channels, the more we seem to be able to get more people to engage. Then at the end, we did surveys or polls. We often intersperse them with the meetings, but this was really helpful for organizing and organizing the structure. If you're going in depth, a poll structure that goes from how are you thinking about it to what is the process to what is the answer can give a kind of structured breakdown, but really just what stands out to you. What is the summary that you want to have? Get a quick sort of something that you can measure and hold, and then you have material to process after. And then all of this builds a kind of potential energy. And it's critical to follow up in the right way, in a way that feels it builds momentum. This is one of the ones that we've succeeded at sometimes, and also had a passive learning. It can work really well if you can have one or two people stay after and start to process the information right there in the room, write a message that can be sent out. But that can also be tiring. And if you do decide to have a meeting afterwards, book another room. We consistently have one or two people who stay on and the discussion continues, right? There's no clean break. So if you have somebody who's a note taker, or a group of a couple of people who are taking notes, have a separate Zoom room or a Skype call or somewhere where they can leave, go to another point and start to assemble and process into one. The most important thing is a follow-up email. Then we also did this kind of mapping and picked icons to represent the idea so that we can feed it back in a way that's visually comprehensible and that people feel comfortable giving feedback on. And so there's editing the documents, editing the material, starting to, if you heard some phrasing, capture the phrasing of why people are saying something matters to them, because you'll keep the high level, but you're going to lose the nuance afterwards. So get a single email and single email drafted, and then try and get as much richness or details or notes on the material. We did a lot of the notes afterwards just in the Google Docs, just trying to consolidate the other formats and the quotes and the visual expression of mind into the Google format, so that there's that process. And we put screenshots. If you have participant permission, you can have screenshots of the team who was there, screenshots of the output from this slide, so you can bring that in later on if needed. Again, think, enter in the chat, and then press enter at the end, go into pairs or small groups, 2 to 4 people works well, and then having this discussion and mapping at the end. That in itself gets you 80% of the way, right? You could wash, rinse, and repeat this method, use it in all kinds of different contexts. And as long as you have really strong clarity about what are you doing, and you follow up in a way that lets people see that momentum, if you do this every 2 months or 4 months, it can start to unlock some of that energy. You get little seeds like, oh, we could ask this person to do this. We could ask this person to do this. We could ask, so it sort of unlocks a larger network if you're watching for that. So that's it. That's our process. It's the 3 sessions that we did. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. I guess we're over to John. John, we'll get you to queue up your slideshow, and
okay.
You have 15 minutes.
All right. Yes, so my presentation is based on my dissertation, Aligning Values and Practice, a comparative analysis of management practices, worker managed co-ops using the Co-op Index tool. A little bit about me. Since 2014, I've worked as a co-op developer with the Northwest Cooperative Development Center based in Olympia, Washington. And I have a special interest in worker co-ops because of my 26-year membership with Union Cab of Madison. At the time when I left, a 250-member taxi cab cooperative in Madison, Wisconsin, and also general support in the worker co-op world. Many of the co-ops that we help are within that community, and often within traditionally low-paid labor with high turnover. So worker cooperation tends to help people gain control over their economic lives. The goal of my research was to examine how self-management by workers creates a workplace that aligns with the cooperative identity, or maybe how it doesn't, in terms of the lived experience of the workers as uncovered through the Co-op Index tool. And I should say, I also come out of the St. Mary's Masters of Management Cooperative and Credit Union program, and worked in also the PhD in Business Administration at the Sobeys School of Business. So I like to start with some foundational quotes. The first two by Mendiaretta of Mondragon. And the first, I think, captures the basic concept of management in the worker co-op, that cooperation is incompatible with any degree of human servitude. People as such cannot be exposed to forms of subordination that compromises their human values. If our worker co-ops simply copy organizations that they rejected to form a co-op, then they really aren't creating anything meaningful, except maybe perhaps a greater share of profits or better wages and purely transactional goals. But this is a path that undermines the basis of working together. The second quote, however, also I think relates to specifically to an experience I've had with worker co-ops, is that sometimes the concept of worker control relates to independent freedom, and so insufficient organization should also not be confused with having respect for freedom. That our cooperatives need to be well managed, and we can't equate individual freedom with worker rights in business. That people have to find a way to avoid recreating the oppression that caused them to join or create a worker co-op without creating a tyranny of individual rights that undermine the ability of the cooperative to succeed. And then finally, one that I find myself using a lot with clients is, and discussions about co-ops that I think also resonates with Jessica Gordon-Emhart's keynote yesterday, said there is nothing about a cooperative that puts a halo on anyone's head, from Tom Webb, who led and helped start the master's program at St. Mary's. And again, being a cooperative by itself doesn't mean that we'll always have good management. So the basic questions were, does the type of management utilized in a worker co-op facilitate or hinder the ability of the organization to express the co-op identity? And then does the co-op index tool assist in examining management efficacy? And without going into, well, I'll talk a little bit about the co-op index in a second. And so this kind of looks at the nature of governance and management, as I think one of the earlier presentations pointed out. Very often boards are seen as dealing with strategy and high idea, the long-term vision, whereas operations is or management is focused on the day-to-day, and that there's a relatively firm line between the two. But in a worker co-op, of course, it is the very people that are on the board are also in the operations, and having to deal with the historical role of the board existing to protect the interests of capital and control labor can create an existential crisis within worker cooperatives. And so because the needs of the workers tend to often become board issues, and we will see that boards will often deal with issues that maybe other co-op types of co-ops, consumer co-ops, for instance, may not really deal with, other than in larger, more strategic or budget-oriented structures. The basically three types of management that we were looking at involve two, I guess probably the most common is traditional hierarchy with the top-down command and control model. They generally use parliamentary decision-making and tends to be more common throughout even worker co-ops and the co-op movement as a whole, pretty much looking like most corporate organizational structures. The other end of that spectrum are collectives that tend to be very flattened structure. They use consensus decision-making where everyone's part of at least the key decisions, or at least then consensus to allow a smaller group to do work. These tend to work best in smaller organizations, sometimes less than 40, although I think that number might even need to be smaller, and a common workplace where the workers are able to actually stop work and take on the roles of managing collectively. The third form is sociocracy, which has been around for a while, but is starting to gain notice within the cooperative world, and especially worker cooperatives. Sociocracy is sometimes described as a hierarchy of work as opposed to a hierarchy of power. It involves creating autonomous circles, or work teams, I guess you could call them, that are double linked, and they sort of top down, bottom up. So you might have the board of directors will appoint someone to be the leader or group leader for the general circle, which would be the equivalent of general manager, but then that circle will also elect someone up to the board. They use a process of consent, which is sometimes described as different than consensus, although there's debate on this, but usually the difference is that in consensus, everybody agrees, whereas in consent, nobody objects. So the idea in consent is that as long as the decision is good enough for now and safe enough to try and doesn't conflict with the overall mission of the circle, then it's that decision goes forward. And the good enough for now is rather important. One of the key parts of sociocracy is to effectively create a series of real experiments where you create a thesis, you test it, and then you review to see if the results match the thesis, and if not, then you change to move along. And so it's there's, like I said, a growing group within. It's still relatively small within the cooperative world. There's only a handful of co-ops that are engaging in it. But I also should say that a number of co-ops fall anywhere between these. So there are co-ops that look a lot like they're using sociocracy, but they would argue they're a network of collectives, or there might be co-ops that have a certain amount of hierarchy, but then use team management that's based on consensus. And so it can be a little bit of a mishmash as you get into the actual way that people are using management and governance in their co-ops. For the Co-op Index tool, for those that may not be familiar with it, it was created through a team at St. Mary's University years ago with a group of academics, co-op developers, and practitioners to find a way to measure the ability of worker co-ops alignment with the co-op identity, using specifically the statement on the co-op identity from the International Co-op Alliance, as well as specific principles of Mondragon that relate to worker cooperation. And so by building this measure against an ideal, we believe that we could see where co-ops are engaging and falling short in their management and operations, as well as their governance as a cooperative. It provides an analysis and recommendations to help co-ops improve their functioning as a value-based organization. And in addition to the surveys, it also compares the results of those surveys to interviews with members, as well as the existing stated policies and procedures of the cooperative to find out where there is perhaps a disconnect. It provides a number of reports. I should say that I am using our original model of the Co-op Index. It's gone through a couple of iterations since then. If there's time, I can talk about that later. But it provides a 30,000 foot or 10,000 meter view, if you will, of indexes of both co-op values and principle index, the organizational maturity index, and then something called the organizational trust index. At the treetop level, that can break down into different dimensions. I know it's hard to read here, but there are different operational dimensions within the organization that can be measured out and looked at, and then within those break down further into, in this case, an example of autonomy and independence, what goes into creating that index or that category, and then dimension of the index principles, and then ultimately into the index. And so you can ultimately get sort of a punch list of things of where the co-op can improve, but also where the co-op's really exceeding. The survey itself is based on a 7-point Likert type scale, where people respond to a statement and answer either anywhere from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The score itself then represents the percentage of workers who respond either as strongly agree or agree. So sort of a top box score. And that's where, when you look at the scores, you'll be able to just see what it refers to. The underpinnings of theoretical underpinnings I was working with come from Hirschman's concept of exit, voice, and loyalty. Simply put, that members of an organization will either choose to use their voice or to use their feet and leave the organization. But loyalty can mediate that. Loyalty may cause people to stay even though they aren't able to really express themselves, or it may actually also impel them to leave and then use their voice to try to change the organization from the outside. Likewise, Rogers and Freeman in 2006, but also following up from research a decade earlier, found that overwhelmingly workers in at least in the US, and want to participate and want to be part of their workplace, more so even than focusing on monetary rewards. It's they want to be treated as humans in the workplace, not simply as tools. And then of course, the co-op identity is there as well to hold cooperatives to a higher standard than simply being a business by meeting the needs of its members. So within that, and I should say that I'm showing the values and principles here, but we actually took all the dimensions as well, the operational dimensions, and broke them down into how much they either enabled people to use their voice or would encourage people to use their voice, versus also whether they might either impel people to exit or maybe create a higher threshold to exit. So for instance, payment solidarity and education, information, and training might, if they are really strong within the organization, might make it less likely for people to leave, whereas participatory control and labor control and participatory management also might create a higher level of voice that will also then dampen people's need to leave the organization. And so from taking the scores from the co-op index we looked at comparative case study with 3 co-ops. 2 were worker co-ops that had a mix of members and non-members. The third one is a consumer co-op that operates with the staff collective. In that case, the staff members are consumer members of the co-op. All of them were consumer members of the co-op, but they managed as a staff collective. So there was no general manager. There was a staff liaison to the board of directors elected by the staff collective. And otherwise, all the decisions operationally are made by the staff collective. Each co-op utilized the co-op index between 2012 and 2015, and each had a different governance model. So one of the worker co-ops had a traditional hierarchical model. One used sociocracy, and then the consumer co-op operated as a collective and with consensus, and at both the board level and the staff. So the overall indexes, the organizational maturity index, the CVI, the cooperative value index, cooperative principle index, and the organizational trust index, we looked at compared the scores. So the traditional hierarchy model scored, honestly about where we often see co-op score in the sort of mid-60s era, but also a relatively high level of trust. The collective, on the other hand, and I should say this was an 80-member collective. They also had about 300 volunteer workers who were not part of the collective and did not participate in the index process. They actually scored relatively low, 43% for operations, but they also have a high level of trust. So it's kind of one of the stories of co-ops that I found is that even if from the outside you don't understand how they're making it work, somehow they make it work. And I think part of that ties into the discussion of loyalty to the concept, if nothing else, and to general trust within organizations. And then lastly, the sociocratic co-op scored amazingly well on all of its scores and really outperformed the other cooperative models with alliance to principles at 90% and hitting almost 80% on values, and even operationally, people felt very engaged, a strong voice, and definitely low turnover, which is something we often see in worker co-ops in most sectors. Just kind of during part of the research team also did some work on the model, on the co-op index and what it was really measuring. And there's a work showing that a lot of the co-op values, which shouldn't surprise us, really relate to scores around human dignity and management. And so looking specifically at these particular scales that are connected to that: self-help, participatory management, trust among workers. Again, we see the same thing, that actually the traditional co-op ended up scoring very well on some of these, whereas the other models were a little bit lighter. And that probably is one of the areas that requires a little bit more research. And also, as you dive into that a little bit deeper, you can see that even while the overall scores provide this kind of treetop view, right, it's still worth getting into the very process, into the trenches, as it were, to look and see specifically where there's some disconnects. And so part of it might be in participatory management, some of the language, of course, of being consulted about tasks entrusted to me that may or may not connect in a sociocratic environment. And so having to take some of that into consideration feeds into then doing some of the interview work. And again, finally, more scales of labor control. And we see here in some of these where sociocracy then really shows a much higher scoring. And again, the collective is just kind of sitting there doing well in some things, but falling a little short in others, which may have a lot to do with the size of their collective. 80-member collective with several different locations can be very difficult to really allow a collective model to meet its potential.
John, I'm mindful we're now biting into our discussion time.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't see your face as a problem. Okay, so I'll just quick limitations. So only 3 co-ops were examined. Not all the employees work at co-ops. And each co-op has unique social needs related to its community and culture. And that's really kind of the limitations. There is some next work on what's happening with the co-op index, but these are just some scores on the coefficiency if people are wondering how reliable the model is. And then the summary is simply that the co-op index does allow co-ops to compare co-ops to each other, not only to an ideal, and there needs to be more stuff. So there you go.
Great, thank you very much, John. Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, Adam. A lot of food for thought there. I see we already have one question in the chat from Judith, who has a question for Kirsten. Does your process vary with groups that differ in terms of education, income, and culture? So I guess we'll start there. Kirsten.
Hey, yeah, we have tested this particular process with those who've shown up. So middle class, engaged, disproportionately white residents of Waterloo. That's not true in all experiments, but disproportionately, there's lots of work in reaching out and trying it in other contexts. I put some notes in the text. Zoom will always have barriers for some accessibility. We had someone at a meeting who joined bedridden, right? And with the video off speaking into it. But on the other hand, it can also bring in people, you know, with lots of small kids climbing on them who might not be able to come to an in-person meeting. So, but in the larger social innovation lab, absolutely, like there's lots of things that we've done. I mean, at the basic level, like having appropriate diversity in the facilitators and the lab. So actually building the structure that runs and facilitates the process so that it engages people, and then that group co-designs it. And depending on the goal, you know, you may be working towards like developing a set of concepts or developing possibilities or developing networks, depending on the context of different, like how much emphasis on building common language, how much emphasis on experiential, actually going into places and visiting them. If it's building the community and bridging barriers, you know, being in a nice place, having dinner and giving people the chance to go on walks and reflect together can do a lot in terms of building context, but there's no substitute for setting up the design has to include the voices of as many people as possible in a way that's strategic, and the design, and then you can also use emergent agendas. So there's ways to structure agendas so that you're able to respond and shift in process. For instance, my mentor in social innovation is really good at that kind of emergent agenda and sort of responding and following the energy in the room. So sometimes even with the best planning, it can go off the rest, or there'll be some subtle clue and you can get at something by guiding, leaning into what's in the room. I don't know if that helps you to.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. I see we don't have any questions in the chat room or hands up yet, so I'll just pose a question while people ponder additional questions they might want to put forward. And I guess this is a question, 2 questions, maybe one for John first, and then for Kirsten. It seems both of you are addressing a big problem for co-ops, which is the problem of democratic degeneration. And so I guess for John, I'm also a recovering member of a worker co-op, and there's of course always a tension between the worker co-op sector and the rest of the cooperative movement. And increasingly this move towards managerialism, where we put board qualifications in place for people, tends to screen out working class people. And so it seems like we become less and less sensitive to the democratic majority of the public and the working class perhaps than we should. So that's maybe a comment and a question for John. And for Kirsten, I guess you really put your finger on the problem of that balance between democratic energy and technocratic control. And again, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how you think this might apply to the larger problem of the bigger co-ops, especially in the mature sectors, who tend to retreat into this kind of managerial culture. So maybe John first and then Kirsten. And we have 5 minutes left. So if there are other questions people want to post, please feel free.
Well, I think one of the aspects of the co-op index is to help co-ops reflect back and see how well they are engaging in that co-op value and openness and connection. I guess I haven't seen. I guess maybe some co-ops do. I guess I haven't really seen a lot of co-ops, worker co-ops with board qualifications. Usually, there tends to be at least communities that I work with, if anything, it's about whether or not managers should be allowed to be members, and then really wanting to make sure there's that control there. But one of the things I would say is sociocracy. One of its values is that it actually allows everyone, whether they're a member or not in a worker co-op, if they're still probationary members, to start practicing democratic control and labor control, and starts training them to become members in a sense. And that once they do become members, also because it builds in this concept that you have to get buy-in, not just on a proposal put forward, but even it's the creating of the proposal is where the democracy really happens. So that by the time you get to asking if there's consent, you probably can read the room and already know whether or not, because everyone has been part of forming that proposal in the first place. And so it can really, I think, break down some of those barriers.
Great, thanks, John. We'll go to Kirsten, and then we've got a final question for Anthony before we wrap up. So Kirsten, if you can keep it to a minute or two, that would be great.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things that like all organizations run into is that the identity of those in it can become tied to the organization rather than to the purpose. Right? There's just so much work of running an organization. One of the things that I like about the lab methodology and like that I think can make it transformative is if it's intended to be a social innovation lab, the people who come in have this real energy around transforming and understanding and shifting and manipulating. And I think organizationally, it's like there's a silo between organizations that have that kind of like transformative orientation and that stability organization. And I think there's benefits to really deeply integrating that. Like I can see interstitial, like purpose-driven network feeding into having actual power in organizations, feeding some of that kind of energy into the structure. And I think it would be sociocracy is that really allowing power in democratic practice at the level of circuits as they emerge. I think that kind of training up and making that a great experience, right? If that's the way you want to live if that's where you want to have your kids at those meetings, planning things, working towards purpose, that kind of like excitement in it, I think can continue to feed into even large organizations. We do a lot of social innovation labs where we're working between sort of networks of organizations, and the people who opt into it get this chance to reflect in a different way. And I think there's inherent problems if you don't have any of that networking across, but I don't know that we have necessarily a great solution.
Okay. Thank you, Kirsten. I'm afraid we've run down the clock, people. I notice there's
Oh.
still a couple of questions stranded in the chat room. So I'd suggest to people talk in the networking lounge and follow up there. And also I'll remind you that this panel continues in the afternoon. So if people want to carry on the conversation in the afternoon, watch for the cooperation and values-based governance, which starts at 1 o'clock. So let me thank the panelists and all the participants. Thank you for your questions. And hopefully we haven't already been cut off. You can still hear me. Thank you, everyone.